Thank you for that, and thanks to all of you for coming out when you could be at South Beach on this perfect day. We have a large and ridiculously talented panel here today, so I'm going to be very brief with the introductions. You can read about all their impressive credentials in your propaganda, and then we'll get right into it and hopefully leave some time for questions as well. Starting at the far end, Sarah Wildman is a globe-trotting correspondent who has reported from Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Jerusalem, and other cities. She's a regular contributor to the New York Times and the New Yorker online, and she's also written a cracker of a new book, Paper Love, a 5-country search for the lover her grandfather left behind when he fled Austria in 1938. Stephen Kurkjian is the quintessential Boston boy. He was born, raised, and educated there, spent 40 years at the Boston Globe, and shared in 3 Pulitzer Prizes. The paper won for its investigative work. Stephen's book, Master Thieves, uncovers the gangland intrigue behind the biggest art theft in history at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. David Kertzer is a world-renowned scholar we'd all like to be because his research keeps taking him to Italy. His latest book, The Pope and Mussolini, explores the intertwined rise of a pontiff and a dictator in 1920s Rome. It won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. David also holds a day job as a professor of anthropology and Italian studies at Brown University. Jeff Hobbs is a little bit of an outlier on this panel since he hits to all fields. He's a novelist, but his new book is nonfiction, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace, about a close friend and college classmate at Yale who succumbs to the demons of his Newark youth. Jeff, obviously a man of many parts, has also worked in Tanzania for the African Rainforest Conservancy. That's correct, isn't it? Good. All right. Never trust the internet. Okay, the theme of this panel is the process of putting together a book. I've lived here for 10 years, and I know that half the people here are either writers, wannabe writers, or just devoted readers who want to understand how you do what you do. So I thought I'd start with how you gather your material. One thing that connects all of you is the depth and difficulty of your research. And writers love to complain, but can you perhaps talk about the joys of losing yourself in an archive, in a court record, in personal interviews with sources, or even toiling through microfilm at a local library, as I know Jeff did. David, since you spent a lot of time in the Vatican archives, why don't you lead off on that one?
Okay, yes, I'm sure we can all tell battle tales and show our scars of work in the archives. But along with all the frustrations, there are great moments of joy. And also just, I think in a Vatican archive for a previous book, I had in my hands a letter by Prince Metternich written in 1840 to the Pope at the time, Gregory XVI, and just taking this kind of musty, dusty document written in the hand of Metternich, there's something almost magical about the sense. Or this most recent book on the Pope and Mussolini. Mussolini, every morning his first meeting was with the police chief, who had this, of course, vast network of spies, including many spies in the Vatican, which provides a lot of juicy material for me. And Mussolini only wrote in blue and red pencil. He had these thick pencils. He would use them down to the stubs because he didn't want to waste anything. And just to see Mussolini write his remarks on the margins of these police reports gives you a kind of a sense of the man that's almost, maybe he might say mystical. There's something, it's hard to put your hands around it, but it really is one of the great joys of doing this kind of research.
Yeah, you feel like you're almost reaching out and touching this person, and there's something weirdly intimate about it.
Yes.
It seems to be what you're saying. Anyone else want to weigh in?
I did not handle such historic documents. Most of mine came out of court files in superior courts or district courts in and around Boston. But in my work as with the Gardner Museum case, because it was an investigation that theft that took place in Boston, it involved me with so much material with people who I knew from one step removed, and there was always someone behind a court document that I could reach out to who connected with me some way or another over the years at the Globe, who would provide me rich material, sort of the anecdotal material, the human emotional material that had just been outlined in the court case itself, which is turned out to be the richness of the book.
For me too, I think that my work is not about Metternichs, it's about regular people. And so what was interesting for me across Europe was the Picayune and important details about regular lives during the Nazi era. And I had a couple of crazy moments. I mean, one was I was in these tiny Czech archives in the far, far, far east of the Czech Republic where it borders on Poland. And I got there and I realized I had no idea what I was looking for. I had no idea what my questions were. And I had not made an appointment, and I had one day. And I get there, and the archivist sort of throws up his hands at me. I mean, this is just totally ridiculous. And we're going over what I'm sort of looking for, and we're asking, and this and that, and the papers are all in German, but he actually doesn't speak German, and it's really complicated, and I don't speak Czech, so I have this interlocutor trying to translate between the two languages, and all of a sudden he says, you know what I might have? I might have the Aryanization papers. And I said, I didn't even think to look for this. This was the woman I was looking for. Her mother had owned a shoe store in this town, and he found for me the papers that defrauded her of her entire life, that she had built from 1912 to 1939. And he said, you might like to see that. I said, I might. I really would. There was one other amazing moment, too, which was that I was the first journalist to go with a group of scholars from the Holocaust Museum in Washington to the last unopened Holocaust archives in Germany, which is called the International Tracing Service, which had become this place of great myth. So everybody was sort of excited that it was this black box of amazing material. And again, no one really knew what they were looking for, and I was looking for a specific person. And again, something amazing happened, which was, and I hadn't known to ask for this, someone else had come looking before me in the 50s. And that opened up a whole new line of inquiry where I could request everything across the archives in Germany that this same person had requested. And that provided for me all of the clues that I'd been missing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, aside from this microfilm that I spent 4 days chasing up and down New Jersey, which ended up being worth it, this book is sort of a eulogy that got out of hand. I was just trying to put some stories together, so it was almost all conversations, starting with friends, and you just talked to my cousin, he knew Rob, and then 3 years later I had 1,300 pages of single-spaced transcripts, which then I had to fact check, but yeah, certainly it's not archival, but I certainly got lost in these conversations, most of which were very joyful.
Can you just expand a bit on something I read in an interview with you about at the same time juggling this research with your personal life?
Oh, sure. As the orbit widened, I was suddenly spending a lot of time with drug dealers, mostly pretty nice guys and girls, very gracious to me, and for real, really put themselves forward to help tell the story. I changed their names. But yeah, at the same time, I'm in Newark a lot, and my daughter, wife back home in California, dealing with schools and pickups and drug dealers' bathrooms and other places where I can take a call. Just sort of winged it most of the time. And in fact, my daughter tagged along with me for some of the research, just logistics with family and trips. So she's sort of there, which probably terrible parenting, but she's cute, and everyone was very nice to her as well.
Probably facilitated your research. Well, maybe just following up on a point that Sarah raised, because one question I have, as we all know, increasingly, I mean, by the month, certainly by the year, so much more is available online. Entire archives, in some cases, are digitized. And in one sense, that's wonderful, but in another sense, I wonder whether, again, it means you're less likely to have the experience that you describe of physically being in an archives and someone leading you to something you might not otherwise not have known existed. So maybe just a little bit about the kind of benefits and pitfalls of this unbelievable online world we're in. And Sarah, why don't you start with that one?
Okay. I too use the Google crutch. I mean, tremendously. We all do. And it is an amazing thing. And it's a great starting point. But I think for me, similar to why I still prefer to read my newspaper in unwieldy large blocks, it means you lose your peripheral vision. You don't get the extra story about Pakistan that you might not have looked at because it's not the headline you always click on. In the same way, you lose those extra little leads that you didn't know you were looking for. And for me, the intersection with the interlocutors in each of these places, you know, for example, in Vienna, I was working with a man named Herbert Posch, who was the first person to try to honor all of the Jews expelled from the university in 1938. And because it was him handing me these files, he then said, do you want to take a walk around and look at the geographic locations and sort of feel it and be there? And that's something you just can't do if you're sitting in a room with Google. You know, you're just not getting that, even if you bring in your screenshot of the street view, which might be helpful. You know, I think there's a lot we can gain, but we lose almost as much in a strange way because we think we don't need more.
I would, just to say a word in praise of what's available online. I'm now working on a book on the Roman Revolution of 1848 when the Pope was driven out of Rome and calls on the Catholic powers of Europe to send their armies to restore him to power. Now, thanks to Google's digitization project, if you go to Hathi Trust and you're part of a university that has helped Google digitize all the books in the world, I've been able to download, I think I've downloaded maybe 400 books, all printed between 1850 and 1865. In the past, there's no way I could have spent 50 years, I would never have gotten copies of all those books. There's no way, even a small fraction of them. So there are, you know, there certainly is a downside, but there are now things available to people doing this kind of historical work, scholars, others interested in this history that just as recently as 10 years ago were not available.
Right, yeah, it's mind-blowing.
I, as a journalist, your first step is much quicker now because of the digital age. And for most journalists, that first step is a very important one to get who, what, where, when, and how. But it doesn't get the why, and the only way to get the why is being there. And as my, you know, as recently as last week, going to introduce myself to a person that wasn't through a phone call and it wasn't through an email. It was a knock on the door. And the door opens and you present your card. And it's what we do, whether you're a journalist or, you know, or as an author. The only way you're going to get the story, unquote, is by knocking on the door and shaking hands.
I would only add that Facebook for me was sort of an easy way to knock on doors.
Right.
Huh, no, I mean,
Right.
good,
To
that's
anybody,
very good, good
yeah.
point.
Just
It's a
reach
way
out.
to find and contact people. I'd only add personally, because when I heard about you toiling through the microfilm, I just hate microfilm and all that. And the fact that I
Machines are
can
always
read
broken.
old newspapers now at
Right.
my computer at
Right.
home, I think newspapers as a resource are being used much more than they once were, just because it was so labor intensive in the old days to sit there and go through old newspapers. So, interesting. Okay, all of you have written about crime in different ways. In a couple of your cases, more it's crimes against humanity. And I've done this a few times and found myself becoming, in essence, an amateur detective and prosecutor. At one point, I wanted to jump up in court and, you know, correct the lawyer and judge because I felt I knew more than they did. So I guess I'm just wondering how you tread the line between being a writer and a litigator. And Stephen, you're the truest sleuth and gumshoe here, so perhaps you can lead us off.
Well, I also am a lawyer. And,
Yeah, that helps.
my summer of '69, in which I covered both the Chappaquiddick case here and Woodstock in successive months, made me realize there's no much more, I'm not going to have anywhere near the fun I'm going to have as a journalist if I went into law. But it all ends up in the courtroom. All debates, all arguments, all controversies end up in the courtroom. Deflategate being the most recent case. So having that background is immensely helpful, and in understanding the terms and understanding the protocol, so that you cannot jump up and say, here, Your Honor, is important.
I would just, actually, this gives me an opportunity to respond to something that Sarah said, which is about doing history about famous people, the Metternichs, the Mussolinis, and so on, versus the 99% of humanity. And in fact, social historians rely very heavily on court cases, because if you're going to get at the 90+% of the people who were illiterate in the past, who didn't leave diaries, didn't leave letters, and so on, the court cases give an incredible insight into their lives. And finding these, hundreds and hundreds of pages of cases dealing with very obscure people. Now I'm thinking of 19th century Italy, but the same would be true of many other situations. Is just, it's almost unexpected. On the other hand, there are cases, in my most recent book, I discovered that the Pope's personal emissary to Mussolini, there was at the time, very well-known case written up in the New York Times where he was assaulted, presumably an anti-fascist assassination attempt on him. A knife went through his throat and so on. And I discovered the file, the police investigation, which showed that actually it had nothing to do with anti-fascism. It had to do with a relationship he had with a young boy. And so there, so when you can discover this kind of material, again, where you get insight that you just can't get in any other way, so it can be very exciting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And there's actually two crimes in this story. One is my friend who was murdered, and the killers were never caught. And I struggled with that. The police were not very helpful because it's still an open case, and it's the Newark police. But also going too far down that road, I didn't want to knock on that door. But the other crime is Rob's father was convicted when Rob was very young of a double murder. And Rob, this was very formative. Rob spent a lot of his life trying to free his father, firmly believed he was innocent, and I learned a lot of things that make it hard to say he was wrong. Most of it's anecdotal, but anyway, I did a lot of research on the case and learned a lot about his father, and just tried to lay it out very objectively. And interestingly, since I've gotten very nasty letters from people saying, how could you make this killer out to be innocent, and also from people saying, how could you possibly take this innocent man and make him seem guilty? So it's challenging, the crime.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I
weigh in on
can. I think there are two pieces in my regular work and in the book. I mean, with this book, and actually with a book that I'm writing an introduction to right now, it's about the mutation of the law under fascism. So law isn't the same way we think of law. When rule of law is distorted, you think of crime in a different way, and crime is perceived of differently in the Second World War in fascist Europe. It just is. And who is a criminal is completely upended. So you have to rethink it and understand this completely upside down world that doesn't connect to our idea of rule of law or democracy. And retrying it is more about the idea of getting into the head of what that meant, what it meant to be illegal, for example, to buy legumes if you were a Jew in Berlin in 1941, to being forced to wear a star, which is something we all know. And then I think modern day, I think what's interesting now, I mean, I've worked a lot on various questions of land use. I mean, there's always these sort of push-pull about who's right and who's wrong, and I think that I think for me, what I end up having to do with court cases is I don't have a law degree, but I have to dig in and understand the law. I sort of have to give myself crash courses in whatever it is the story is I'm working on.
Right. All right, well, let's maybe turn for a moment from the hard labor of research to the fun of writing. As we all know, being a writer means a life of ease and decadence. You spend your days in a clean, well-lighted place, crafting perfect sentences, perhaps with a bottle of absinthe for inspiration, and then your evenings are book parties or gatherings like this, surrounded by adoring readers. Not to mention the high two-figure book advances. So maybe I'd like to just hear a little from each of you about the reality of your writing life. And since you're at least a sometimes novelist and therefore the most romantic of the crew, tell us about your dreamy writing life.
Sure. It starts at 4 a.m. when I try to just get 2 hours of quiet, and then, children and fuss happen. But I get a few hours in the morning. I work in the garage, which opens onto just again surrounded by diapers and old junk. But it opens onto this alley. I used to complain to my wife when we moved to LA that, everyone's in their cars. You don't see anything on the street. So she moved this table into the garage and opened the door and said, enjoy. So, a lot of very friendly homeless guys. One who sort of mimes a baseball game every day. So he sort of pitches bats, fields. Seems to be about 9 innings. A gentleman across the street who owns the apartment is either sort of walking around in the garbage dumpsters for some reason, or else he's trying to sue people, including me, just for sort of sitting there. So it's interesting. His name is George.
It's a hard one to follow. Whoever wants to dive in after that.
I had written this story many times, about this story, the Gardner Museum art theft, many times with Boston Globe. I had covered it from the late 90s until my retirement in '07. And I thought I would have a pretty good, amount of material to get into. But I realized I had written everything already for the Globe. I didn't have anything new to say, so I went out and did some more reporting and to try to tie up some loose ends. And when I went down to my writing room, it wasn't working at all down there, so I went into the libraries. I found libraries that I could work in. And because I think it was having grown up, I spent my adult life in newsroom, was a lot of clatter and a lot of, human action and reaction. I needed that. And so I went from Brookline to Newton to Boston to South Boston to Plymouth. And the muse kept jumping. And if it seemed to dim out in one place, I found another library. And the Newton was the best of all, I have to say, though, because they had small little rooms off of one of the main archives rooms. And I could take calls in there. I could put on my radio in there, and then I could walk outside and get a bit of fresh air. And it was tough to come up with a sort of an analytical piece, an analytical book on something that I had written just in very quick and flash-oriented news articles. But having libraries and the human action and the reaction of libraries helped immensely for me.
All right, the movable feast.
Yeah, it was a movable feast.
I assume we're talking on a laptop, not...
Yeah.
You
No,
could
no
be
more-
an advertisement
no
for
more
some
yellow,
brand of
no
laptop.
more yellow pads.
Couldn't do that with a desktop, yeah.
So I did this book through 2 pregnancies. So my diapers were just as internal, I suppose. So my first draft of my book was due 2 days after my due date. So I turned in my book, the first draft, 2 days before, and then they sent it back 6 weeks later. So I had my foot on the bouncy thing while I bounced her and went through the return draft. And I did that until she was sort of a coherent thing and knew who I was. And so it actually was really helpful because of breastfeeding. I could sort of do both. But after a while, it stopped working. And so then I developed relationships with various places, like a vegan soup place down the block, which gave me their own internal Wi-Fi code. I didn't have to buy it anymore because they felt badly for me. And I would sit in the corner and work there with massive headphones on because I started getting angry with people who came in to actually eat. And I felt very curmudgeonly about the people around me. But I have recently also discovered libraries because actually I don't mind that kind of bustle, but I didn't like people who came to eat and talk. I felt like that was really unfair. It was totally interrupting me.
I'm amazed by authors who say they go to their local cafe, Starbucks or something, and open up their laptop computer and write. I've never been able to do that with bustle and so on. Or, on the other hand, stand in awe and amazement of the writers. You read about the full-time prominent lawyers who wake up at 3 a.m.
Right.
and write from 3 to 6:30 every day, and I haven't been able to do that, so I'm confessing my limitations here. Susan, who's here, my wife, says that you could just put me in a closet and I could write, so I don't need external stimuli. And now it gets back to our digitization. Once you gathered everything, at least the way I work, I've got everything digitized on my computer. So one of the good things it means, it used to be I'd sort of need to be in one place to write. I had all my stuff and thousands of pages of photocopies and copies of books. Now everything I have on my computer, I've digitized everything, so I can spend a month in Paris and a month in Rome and a month somewhere, so it's a lot of fun, and unpunctuated by pregnancies in recent times, so that's how it's done.
Fascinated by the variety of answers to that. Shows you the creative process can happen in interesting ways. I'm a little jealous of Sarah. My mother was a writer, but she confessed that she nursed me with a highball in one hand and a cigarette in the other. So I wish she'd actually been at her typewriter or something. I wonder whether I would have been a different person. Anyway, I don't have a watch. Do I have time for one more general question, or should we go to the audience? All right, one more then. Again, because I know people are always fascinated about this, just, your topics, how you choose book topics, which we all know is, in some ways, the most decisive and difficult piece of it all. And I'm curious, at least with your most recent works, whether they came from sort of aha moments of inspiration, or was it more like a slow burn or a slow build based on something you'd been mulling or researching for years that just you came to that moment where you said, I'm going to take the jump? And really, whoever wants to dive in on that one first.
Having worked on the story for the Globe for several years, it was a natural for me when I retired. My first agent said to me, Steve, though, you've got to solve the crime. There's no book here unless we recover the paintings, which I tried to do for a couple of years while I did other things, and I realized how difficult the FBI's work is in recovering the paintings. When I told him that I was going to now sit down and write the book, he said, but there's no book. He was wrong. There was a book, and it was tying in the loose ends of this case. I think I came to it because I was so interested. I'm a Boston boy. This is Boston's last best secret. But the next story in me, the next book in me, hopefully I have the years, is about my heritage and my Armenianness. And that's been something that I've lived with all my life in our history here in the United States and in, quote, the old country. And that's a more organic book to me. And that's, when you work for a newspaper, you get ordered to do things. It's top down. This is more organic. I think it's going to be a couple of years before I see the forest from the trees. But I think it's probably even a more important book as far as what's important to me.
Mm-hmm. Anyone?
I'll go next. This one, obviously, my friend died, and it's not as though I went to his funeral or came home from his funeral thinking I'm going to write a book about Rob. And it's hard in retrospect to pinpoint a moment. But again, I think I mentioned earlier, just people sending me to other people, and suddenly there's just so much information and really relevant information. And I guess I blurted to somebody, probably foolishly, maybe this could be a book, or I don't really know what I'm doing, but there's a lot, and it matters. So that happened. But more broadly, what's so neat about nonfiction, in a way that's different from fiction, is that you can, any article you read, anything that fascinates you, you can just go and learn everything you can learn about it, whether it's a person or something in your family, and it's so energizing.
Wait,
I'm
but
so
we're
sad
all
I'm-
jealous of you novelists, because you can just make stuff up. We have to go out and find something to write about. Are you saying this is, you're seeing the light now, and you're going to tell the truth for the rest of your writing?
I mean, for me, again, this garage and talking to my dog versus being out in the universe, sort of people, not just drug dealers, but just
Right.
normal people, also government leaders, interesting people. There's such engagement, and you drink a lot less when you're doing nonfiction, or I did, anyway. Just because you're driving a lot, I guess. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Future panel, nonfiction versus fiction. Yeah.
Well, with this book, I actually for a long time didn't think it was a book. It had started as a series for Slate on these unopened archives and the mythology of the archives, and I knew about this lover of my grandfather's, and I was sort of obsessed with her, but for a really long time, I thought, there's no book. It took me a long so I was telling different smaller stories and sort of became really interested in the idea of what happened to the sort of Sarah Wildmans, the regular people that didn't own big art, that aren't being debated. They're not the women in gold. So what happened to them? And I was telling those stories across Europe and telling them, and also thinking about it now. I mean, thinking about the conflicts in the Middle East and trying to tell stories about regular people. But I kept coming back to this one. And for me, this also became about this question of memory and passage of memory. And I joked about doing this during 2 pregnancies, and sometimes in my talks I'll say I was growing little Jews in pursuit of lost Jews. But, I think that there was something about that transition between generations that really weighed on me as I was reporting about other people and thinking, how will I tell these stories to people who won't know this generation? And so that became a motivating factor for me.
Great.
There are a couple of my books I can date to a particular moment, and this is one, Pope and Mussolini. The recent one is one because it was in 2002 that the then Pope, John Paul II, announced he was authorizing the opening of the Vatican archives for the papacy of Pius XI, who was Pope in the 1920s and 1930s. And one thing that's always, I guess you might say, irked me, I've lived many years in Italy, is the way in which Italians, who are great people, but can't really face their own fascist past, I think. And in that sense, the church is part of the same thing. So there'd been a standard narrative about the church and its relationship with Mussolini and the fascist regime, namely that it was the biggest opponent of fascism. And I had various reasons from previous work to be skeptical, but it was only with the opening of the archives that one could really know what the story is for sure. So that's why I came to do this.
Right. Why don't we open it up at this point? I'm sure some of you have questions, and please just keep them kind of brief and to the point rather than public statements. And we have microphones set up, so maybe that's the easiest way, and I'm sort of behind a post here, but this lady here, yeah.
Thank you so much for your research and your work, and to bring new vistas, points of view to us. I'm wondering, when you finish your work, when you finish writing, what is it about the characters, or what is it about that experience that either shapes, reshapes, or sticks with you, that changes who you are?
Yeah, I'll jump into this. I'm sure it's different for every person and every project. In this case, I learned an awful lot about race. I look how I look. My friend was black. And when I met him at age 18, I considered myself pretty savvy when it came to black culture. This because I ran track, and my teammates called me an honorary black man. You know, it's hard to learn as an adult that you were stupid when you were a kid. Also very valuable. So he took that away, certainly.
For me, I guess that nothing has really shown me the privilege of my own life more than working on this book, and what would happen if everything you ever had known was taken from you day by day, by small decree after small decree. There's that. And in the middle of the book, actually, on a different subject, but similarly changed me, I took a break to do some stories out of Jerusalem, which is not really a break if you're going to go from Holocaust to the Middle East conflict. But in the middle of it, I interviewed this Palestinian woman who was about to lose her house. It's a long story. It was very complicated. I was super pregnant. And all of a sudden, she stopped the interview. And I said, why? And she said, it was through a translator, and she said, it's not healthy for your baby that you seem so sad. And I realized that I was coming into it really distanced, and she didn't want me to see her that way. That it was this interesting moment where I had to reevaluate how I was coming into the situation entirely. And here I am, this Jewish, enormously pregnant person sitting in her space, which I think is always complicated. I mean, if you think about it in terms of our conversations about race, it's conversations about conflict. And here she really wanted me to see her as a mother. You know, and she said, and I said, well, what should we talk about instead? And so it's through the translation, and they come back to me and they said, we'd like to help you name her. And I said, well, I'm Ashkenazi, so we use a letter from someone who's passed, and so we're looking for an H. And so the room, they start naming names and H names. This means love, and this means grace, and this means this. And then they started laughing, and it changed the space entirely. And all of a sudden, it became about this mutual experience.
Either of you want to weigh in on that? Or well, I'll follow. I'm just curious, because both of you guys cover bad guys. How do you balance, you know, related to the lady's question of, I mean, is there some grudging affection or admiration for these people along the way?
What I learned is their culture, the bad guy culture, and the myth that they live in. One of the more important ones for my book was a myth that having something valuable, having stolen something valuable, is like a get out of jail free card for you or somebody whom you're close to. And no matter how many times, and I talked to several of the bad guys around this case, and it was one of the newest thing that came into my book is the motive. And that was why this theft was commissioned. To try to explain to the bad guys that really you've got no history here. There's no actual event which a get out, stealing a piece of artwork is a get out of jail free card. And having them look at me with all my experience and all my background and all my credentials, and them saying to me, with absolute certainty, like we're in just different worlds. Steve, you don't know what it's like out there in the crime world. You can get your brother-in-law out of jail free if you steal a Rembrandt. And I'll shake my head and says, it's never happened. They're never going to do it. And why you people continue to believe that stealing a piece of artwork like this will free someone inside your criminal world is just a fiction, but you can't explain. It's talking from our lives, from the way we make decisions, and how we give counsel or advice. It's not the way they work. They have a different set of experiences in rumor and innuendo and suspicion that they operate under. And for me to understand that was a light went on in my mind.
I would the Italian title of my book, so English, is The Pope and Mussolini. The Italian, Rizzoli's title was Il patto col diavolo, The Pact with the Devil. And some people ask me, which one was the devil? But let me answer your question by going back to an earlier book. I did a book called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara about the case of an inquisition where a small Jewish child was taken on order of the inquisitor on the grounds that he'd been secretly baptized by a Christian servant girl and therefore was now Christian, so couldn't be raised by Jews. And in writing that, so the book featured, on the one hand, this family, obscure family, desperate, trying to get their child back, and the other, the Pope, back then Pope Pius IX, is 1858, who, as a matter of religious principle, is holding on to this child despite the fact it's become an international cause célèbre, including in the United States. To me, writing that book as a book of here's the good guys and the white hats are the black hats, the bad guys, it would have made a terrible book. And it's made terrible plays. There have been attempts over this from the 19th century to do plays based on this historical account, and have the evil Pope and this heroic Jewish family. But to really understand why the Pope, and he said, you were costing me the Papal States, which it did in a way, his temporal power, yet he felt, to understand that mind view, how he could take that 6-year-old child from the family, to me that was the challenge. So if that was a bad guy, understanding him in a different way, I think was what my goal was anyway.
Right. Empathy or understanding. There was someone standing a moment ago. Yeah.
Just for each of you, Stephen, you kind of, and Sarah, you kind of alluded to this. How do you transition between or overlap the research and the writing? Like, do you do a lot of research and then decide, okay, I'm ready to sit down, I've got it all?
Yeah.
Or do you, how do you guys do that?
Well, mine, I think, is a little bit different from others here in that I had done so much reporting in researching, but it was essential for me to tell the story new. And so when I got my book contract in 2013, and I looked over the material, I knew I had to go out and get new stuff. And it was a bit of a scramble by which I'd come up with new stuff, and I would just go talk to the people right away. And because I was coming up with new material and a new way of understanding this theft. I like to do it that way because then I could get it down. I've got what I think is the synthesis, both the hard reporting and the analysis of this chapter done, and then I'm moving on. But it's my training. It's 40 years of being in the newspaper business. I found a quote early on when I was writing the book that was Hemingway quote. It had said, being a reporter can help you be a better writer, but you have to have quit in time. That was a scary quote for me.
Well, I guess for me, I had a really hard time sitting. I mean, I did 2 different phases of it. Bless you. I because I did this original series, so I had done some of the writing, and then there were certain moments when I was doing really in space things. So when I came back from certain trips, I would try to draft pieces, especially of the scenes. I tried to make sure I was keeping a really good journal, and also writing scenes as they happened, or at least bits of the scenes as they happened, in addition to my tapes and things like that. But for me, the overall writing, I had a really hard time with the fact that obviously the Second World War is well-trammeled material. So I had a hard time stopping reading. I was reading and reading and reading and ordering more books and reading more books and thinking, oh, well, I should have all this woman's letters, so I should read other letter writers. I should read other, I had a really hard time starting and realizing I wasn't going to read the entire canon that's been written on the Holocaust before I began.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I would just add to that, also, maybe you won't agree with me, more research is always more fun than sitting down to pull it all together. So it's always easy to say, gee, maybe one more trip to the archives, or maybe 6 more books on World War II before I sit down to write. Yeah. I don't have time, but why don't we try one more question, and then an organizer Yeah, okay, thank you. So one more
Okay,
question.
A quick one. I was wondering, were all you researchers, and you particularly, Jeff, if you've ever come across material that you think should have been included in the book, but might be harmful to maybe you or to the people that you're chronicling?
Yeah, that certainly happened, and you have to make those decisions, and that's sort of a big responsibility when you're distilling really big factual stories into, you know, this authoritative, permanent account, certainly. And, you know, I guess a corollary to that is finding out something that you wish hadn't happened, and you would rather not put in, but you sort of have to, and that happened as well. And yeah, you're just constantly making these choices with sort of the burden of knowing this is that there's still power in the written word, and this is a permanent ink on paper you're doing.
Anyone else on that? Or maybe to put it a different way, just speaking from personal experience, you sweat over these issues, and then your book comes out, and it turns out the things you thought might cause a stir or embarrass someone that you agonized over doesn't, and then something completely out of left field that you didn't think about for 2 seconds becomes a huge issue. I don't know if any of you have had that. It's very hard to know how your book will be received.
Yeah, well, I'll just use that case I mentioned before. So the Pope had this Jesuit emissary to Mussolini, who met with him once a month, bringing the Pope's list of demands for that month of Mussolini. And I discovered what I mentioned before about this incident of his attempted assassination at a book presentation. And I didn't really think this was terribly controversial. I mean, I knew it would be a little bit sensational in certain very limited Jesuit quarters, but beyond that. But at the presentation of my book in New York at NYU, there was a panelist who's a Jesuit historian, and he really attacked me, saying, you know, I couldn't be a serious historian because clearly I didn't realize that this Jesuit himself gave a detailed account of what happened to him, which is there was an anti-fascist plot, and it was the anti-fascists who tried to murder him. When I mentioned, well, have you read the 150-page file or 250-page police file on this case? And he hadn't. He'd read this Jesuit's account of what had happened to him. So, but I see that immediately, and this gets perhaps to something we haven't entirely talked about now, the age of Twitter and Facebook, we alluded to it. He and certain other folks who won't get mentioned here immediately put online a YouTube of his attack on me without my response. And, you know, so it's, you sometimes get hit by these cases.
Get blindsided, yeah. Anyone else want to take a crack at that? Print, don't print, midnight sweats over what you're about to write?
I did something I never did as a reporter. I would send paragraphs to individuals whom I was writing about. Understand, I'm writing about an ongoing investigation, lots of libel issues involved here, which I always face at the Globe. But, you know, we made sure through lots of layering of editing and lawyering that what I had could be completely backed up. This was something different because I was, quote, out there alone, unquote, and with my publisher certainly, but it was only me who was deciding what was getting in. And I didn't want what I call the red light theory happening to me. The red light theory being when you come into the paper the next morning and the red light is on and your phone is on, on your office phone, there's only 2 people who have called you. One is your mother to say, I saw your story, and the other is the person you've written about, say you got something wrong and we're going to sue you. So I wanted to, I didn't have that backup, so I made sure I sent it out. And for the most part, you know, we got quibbled over some descriptive material. There was never a problem. In the sort of investigative stuff, the biggest harm is surprise. So if you just engage the outside world, you engage the person you're writing about with how you're characterizing him or for the most part, even though you end with a difference of opinion, the surprise is taken out of it, and the world awaits your analysis.
Okay. I think we're wrapping up. I don't know if, Sarah, you wanted to dive in with anything on that, or otherwise we'll wrap up. Yeah. I just want to encourage you to buy books in addition to making donations, et cetera, to the festival. Even if you're not going to read them, they've written wonderful books. Give them as gifts. Forgive me, but I know part of how we entice great writers here is the promise of moving some units, and selling books is what makes it possible for them to do what they do, and also a bunch of grapes to be here. So, open your wallets for what I can tell you are 4 great books. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you later.